It started with a stage, a spotlight, and a royal symbol that was never meant to leave British soil. When Prince Harry stepped onto that American platform, few noticed the subtle detail, but inside palace walls, alarm bells rang instantly. What appeared to be just another paid appearance quickly escalated into something far more serious, a potential misuse of crown property. And behind closed doors, Prince William was already preparing his response. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first glance, it all seemed routine. A polished speech delivered to a high-paying audience, another chapter in Harry's post-royal career, another moment of global attention. But beneath the applause and carefully curated messaging, something subtle lingered, something that didn't quite belong in a commercial setting. It wasn't loud or obvious. In fact, many watching never noticed it at all. Yet for those trained to guard the integrity of the monarchy, it stood out immediately, like a crack in glass that threatens to shatter everything around it. Reports began to circulate quietly, almost cautiously. Palace aides, known for their discipline and restraint, didn't rush to conclusions. Instead, they observed, analyzed, and questioned. Was it intentional? Was it a misunderstanding? Or was it something more calculated, something that blurred the line between personal identity and institutional ownership? Because within royal circles, that line is not just symbolic. It is sacred. Within hours, word is said to have reached Prince William. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, efficient channels that define palace operations. A briefing, a file, a conversation held behind closed doors. And with each passing moment, the tone reportedly shifted from curiosity to concern, from concern to something far more serious. Because this wasn't simply about optics. It was about precedent. Early, whispers of unauthorized commercial use began to echo through internal discussions. Not publicly, not yet, but enough to signal that this situation was being taken seriously at the highest levels. Some insiders, according to various interpretations, initially dismissed the moment as harmless branding, a natural extension of Harry's independent path. But others saw something different. They saw a line being crossed, perhaps unintentionally, but crossed nonetheless. And as these conversations unfolded, tension began to build, not in explosive arguments or public statements, but in silence. The kind of silence that signals something is being carefully evaluated, something is being prepared. Because in the world of the monarchy, responses are rarely immediate. They are deliberate, measured, and when they come, they carry weight. What made this moment particularly unsettling wasn't just the act itself, but the implications it carried. If one royal could leverage elements tied to the crown, in a commercial space, what would stop others? Where would the boundary be drawn? And who would enforce it? These were not questions with simple answers. They were questions that struck at the very core of what the monarchy represents. And somewhere within those palace walls, as discussions deepened and positions quietly formed, one thing became increasingly clear. This was no longer just about a single appearance. It was about something far bigger, far more consequential. A test of limits, a challenge to tradition, a moment that could redefine how the crown is protected in a modern world. But what looked like a minor breach of protocol was, in reality, tied to something far more sensitive, something rooted in the very definition of royal ownership itself. For centuries, the line between personal identity and royal property has been fiercely protected, an invisible boundary few dare to cross. But in the modern age of branding and global influence, that line has never been more fragile. And when it is crossed, the consequences are rarely immediate, but always inevitable. To understand why the reaction inside palace walls was so measured yet so intense, one must first understand the nature of what is truly at stake. The crown is not simply a title, nor is it a collection of privileges granted to individuals. It is an institution ancient, layered, and governed by rules that have been shaped over generations. Within that institution lies a distinction so critical that even senior royals tread carefully around it: the difference between what belongs to the individual and what belongs to the crown. And those two are not the same. Estates like Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House are often misunderstood by the public as simply royal homes. But their meaning runs deeper. These places are tied to history, to continuity, to the idea that the monarchy exists beyond any one person. They may be occupied by individuals, but they are preserved as part of something far greater, a legacy that is passed down, protected, and never casually exploited. This is why every association, every symbol, every reference connected to the crown carries weight, because it is never just personal. It is institutional. And this is where the tension begins to sharpen. Because when a royal figure steps into a commercial space, the boundaries that once felt clear can begin to blur. What is being presented as personal identity may still carry the imprint of the institution. A title, a crest, even an implied connection, these are not mere decorations. They are, as some experts describe, part of a national trust. Not owned, but held. Not for profit, but for purpose. The legal frameworks surrounding this are complex, but they exist for a reason. Instruments such as royal warrants and long-standing protocols alongside documents like letters patent have historically ensured that the monarchy's symbols are not used in ways that could diminish their meaning. These frameworks are not about restriction for its own sake. They are about preservation, because once a royal symbol is commercialized, even subtly, it risks becoming something else entirely, something transactional, something ordinary. And that is precisely what the institution has always sought to avoid. This is why commercial use is so tightly controlled. Not because it is impossible, but because it must be deliberate, sanctioned, and aligned with the crown's broader role. Anything outside of that framework raises questions. Questions about intent, questions about authority, and perhaps most importantly, questions about precedent. Because if one instance is allowed to pass without scrutiny, it opens the door for others to follow. According to various interpretations and insiders familiar with these protocols, Prince Harry's recent move may have tested these boundaries in a way that few expected. Not through overt defiance, but through subtlety, through a blending of personal brand and institutional identity that left room for interpretation. And it is within that ambiguity that concern began to grow. Quietly at first, then with increasing urgency. Palace legal teams, known for their discretion, are said to have taken a closer look, not rushing to conclusions, but examining the implications with care. Because this was no longer just about one moment. It was about what that moment represented. A potential shift, a possible challenge to long-standing norms. And in an institution built on continuity, even the smallest shift can carry enormous consequences. And according to insiders, it wasn't just the act itself that caused concern, it was how it was done, and who may have approved it. The footage was replayed again and again inside palace offices, not for admiration, but for evidence. Frame by frame, detail by detail, something became unmistakably clear. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. And if proven true, it could trigger consequences no one in the royal family had faced in decades. What had once seemed like a fleeting moment during a polished appearance began to take on a different weight entirely. The focus narrowed, not on the speech itself, but on the subtle inclusion that had slipped into view, an element tied, however quietly, to the authority of the crown. It wasn't loud, it wasn't declared, but it was there. And in the world of monarchy, presence alone is enough to raise questions that cannot be ignored. Those familiar with royal protocol understand that nothing connected to the crown appears without meaning. Every symbol, every reference, every association is governed by an unspoken discipline that has been upheld for generations. So when this particular detail surfaced in a commercial context, it didn't just stand out, it disrupted. It suggested intent, or at the very least, a level of awareness that made coincidence increasingly difficult to accept. According to various interpretations circulating among insiders, this moment may not have been spontaneous at all. There are whispers carefully phrased, never confirmed, that prior planning could have played a role. That decisions were made well before the event, that what unfolded on stage was not simply an oversight, but part of a broader strategy to merge personal narrative with institutional identity. And if that is true, even in part, the implications stretch far beyond a single appearance. Media analysts, initially focused on the speech itself, began to shift their attention. Questions started to emerge, not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. Was this within legal boundaries? Could elements tied to the monarchy be used in this way without formal approval? And perhaps most importantly, who decides where that line is drawn? These questions didn't yet dominate headlines, but they lingered, growing in weight with each passing day. Inside palace circles, the tone was markedly different. What the public saw as subtle, insiders described as highly unusual, not necessarily in its visibility, but in its implications. Because even the smallest deviation from protocol can carry enormous significance when it involves the crown. And here, the deviation, however nuanced, was enough to trigger a deeper examination. Legal advisors, known for their precision and discretion, are said to have begun assembling documentation, quietly, methodically, not in response to public pressure, but in anticipation of what this situation might evolve into. Because in matters like these, the question is never just what happened, it is what it means, and what it allows moving forward. Every detail becomes part of a larger puzzle, one that must be understood before any action is taken. At the same time, a divide began to take shape. On one side, public perception remained largely indifferent, viewing the moment as another step in Harry's independent journey. On the other, within the institution itself, concern deepened. Not out of emotion, but out of responsibility. Because if this moment set a precedent, even unintentionally, it could redefine how the crown is perceived and used in the modern world. And that is where the tension truly lies. Not in what was seen, but in what it could lead to. Because once a boundary is tested, it rarely remains untouched. It invites scrutiny. It demands response. And within the monarchy, responses are never rushed, but they are rarely avoided. What followed wasn't a public statement, but something far more decisive, unfolding entirely behind closed doors. There was no press conference, no immediate outrage, just silence, and within that silence, action. Prince William, known for his measured approach, didn't react emotionally. Instead, he moved with precision, activating a process that had remained dormant for years. What followed was not visible to the public, but its impact was felt almost immediately within the inner structure of the monarchy. Consultations began quiet, deliberate, and highly controlled. Senior legal advisors were brought into discussions, not as a reactionary measure, but as part of a calculated response. Palace officials, many of whom had spent decades navigating the delicate balance between tradition and modernity, were asked to weigh in, not on the optics, but on the implications. Because this was no longer about perception. It was about protocol, authority, and the long-term protection of something far greater than any one individual. At the center of these discussions was a single, pressing question. Had a boundary been crossed in a way that required formal intervention? To answer that, internal review protocols rarely used, and even more rarely acknowledged, were quietly set into motion. These protocols exist for moments exactly like this, when the lines between personal action and institutional consequence begin to blur. And once activated, they do not operate on emotion. They operate on evidence. Documentation requests began to circulate. Not broadly, not publicly, but within tightly controlled channels. Details of the speaking engagement, the elements used, the context in which they appeared, everything was examined. Legal briefings were prepared, outlining not just what had happened, but what it could mean moving forward. Because in the monarchy, precedent is everything, and allowing one ambiguous moment to pass without scrutiny could open the door to far more significant challenges in the future. At the same time, coordination extended beyond the immediate palace environment. Institutional figures connected to crown property and royal oversight were quietly engaged. These are individuals in offices that operate behind the scenes, rarely mentioned, but essential to maintaining the integrity of the system. Their involvement signaled something important. This was not being treated as an isolated incident. It was being approached as a matter of institutional significance. Subtle signals began to move through official channels. Nothing overt. No direct statements. But within the structure of the monarchy, even the smallest shift can carry meaning. Meetings scheduled. Communications adjusted. Priorities recalibrated. To the outside world, nothing appeared to change. But inside, the atmosphere was evolving, tightening, focusing, preparing. This marked the beginning of what insiders have described, in careful terms, as a formal assessment. Not an accusation. Not yet. But a structured evaluation of actions, implications, and potential outcomes. And once such an assessment begins, it rarely remains contained. It builds. It gathers momentum. and it places increasing pressure on every layer of the institution to respond with clarity and authority. That pressure, though unseen, was undeniable. It moved through conversations, through decisions, through the very rhythm of palace operations. Because this was no longer just about what had happened, it was about what would happen next, and whether the monarchy as an institution would allow ambiguity to define its boundaries, or whether it would reassert control in a way that left no room for doubt. But the implications of this quiet move extended far beyond one event. It threatened to redefine Prince Harry's standing entirely. What was once a deeply personal rift was now evolving into something far more complex and far more permanent. The divide between the brothers was no longer just emotional, it was becoming institutional, written not in words, but in legal frameworks and royal authority. For years, the tension between Prince William and Prince Harry had been framed as a family matter: misunderstandings, distance, different paths, something human, something that, at least in theory, could be repaired. But what was unfolding now felt different, heavier. Because this was no longer about conversations that could be revisited or emotions that could be reconciled. This had crossed into territory where decisions are recorded, evaluated, and once made rarely reversed. Behind closed doors, what began as quiet concern was now being treated with increasing formality. Discussions were no longer speculative, they were structured. Legal considerations, once a distant possibility, had entered the conversation with a seriousness that could not be ignored. And while no public statement confirmed this shift, insiders suggest that the tone had changed completely. What had once been handled with caution was now being approached with clarity and with consequence in mind. At the same time, communication between the brothers was said to have grown even more strained, not necessarily through open conflict, but through absence. Silence where there had once been at least an attempt at dialogue. And in that silence, interpretations began to form. Some saw it as distance. Others saw it as a signal that the situation had moved beyond personal resolution and into something far more rigid. Because when institutional processes begin, personal conversations often fade into the background. Publicly, the reaction remained mixed. To many, this still appeared to be part of Harry's independent journey, another example of a royal stepping outside traditional boundaries. The narrative of reinvention, of forging a new identity, continued to resonate. But internally, the seriousness of the situation told a different story. Because within the monarchy, perception is only one layer. Beneath it lies structure. And that structure does not bend easily. Experts and commentators, observing from the outside, began to weigh in with increasing intensity. Some suggested that this moment could lead to clearer definitions of what former working royals can and cannot do. Others warned that failing to address it could weaken the very boundaries that have preserved the institution for generations. And while opinions varied, one theme remained consistent: the need to protect precedent, because once a line is crossed without response, it risks disappearing altogether. As media scrutiny intensified, every detail was examined, every implication explored. What had once been a subtle moment was now part of a much larger narrative, one that questioned not just individual actions, but the future of royal identity in a rapidly changing world. And with each passing day, the pressure grew. Not just on those directly involved, but on the institution itself to respond in a way that balanced tradition with modern reality. And perhaps most striking of all was the growing realization that some lines, once crossed, cannot simply be stepped back over. They leave a mark. They alter expectations. They redefine what is possible and what is not. And in a system built on continuity, even a small shift can have lasting consequences. And as the situation intensified, one question began to dominate every conversation within royal circles: what happens next? In the end, this was never just about a speech. It was about something far more enduring than the meaning of the crown itself. And when that meaning is challenged, the response is never simple and never without consequence. What began as a single moment on an international stage had now expanded into a question that reached far beyond one individual. It touched the very foundation of how the monarchy exists in a modern world, how it presents itself, how it protects itself, and how it draws the line between personal freedom and institutional responsibility. Because in an era where global influence can be monetized and identity can be shaped across platforms, the monarchy faces a challenge it has never fully encountered before, remaining timeless in a world that moves faster than tradition was ever designed to follow. At the center of this tension lies the crown itself, not as a symbol of privilege, but as a representation of national identity. It is not owned. It is not borrowed. It is held in trust, carried forward by each generation with the expectation that it will remain intact for the next. And this is why even the slightest suggestion of personal leverage tied to that symbol creates unease. Because once the crown becomes part of a personal narrative in a commercial sense, its meaning risks shifting. Quietly at first, but inevitably. For Prince Harry, the long-term implications of this moment may extend far beyond immediate reactions. This is no longer just about independence or redefining a role outside the traditional framework. It is about how that independence intersects with an institution that operates on continuity and restraint. And if those two forces remain in conflict, the distance between them may only grow, not through dramatic declarations, but through gradual, irreversible change. Meanwhile, Prince William finds himself in a position that carries its own weight, not just as a brother, but as a future king. His role is no longer defined solely by personal relationships, but by responsibility to the institution itself. And that responsibility demands something difficult: the ability to separate emotion from duty. To act not as an individual, but as a guardian of something far larger. Because preserving the integrity of the monarchy is not optional. It is the role he has been preparing for his entire life. Possible outcomes remain uncertain, but they are being considered with increasing seriousness. Restrictions may be clarified. Boundaries may be reinforced. Precedents may be set that define how former working royals engage with the world beyond palace walls. And while none of these outcomes are guaranteed, the fact that they are being discussed at all signals just how significant this moment has become. Because the monarchy does not act without reason, and it does not act without considering the future. And yet, beneath all of this, there remains something unresolved, a tension that cannot be fully addressed through legal frameworks or institutional decisions. Because at its core, this is still a story of family, of legacy, of two paths that once ran parallel, now moving further apart with each passing decision. And while the institution may endure, the personal cost of that endurance is something far more difficult to measure. That is what gives this moment its weight. Not just the immediate consequences, but the quiet realization that some choices, once made, cannot be undone. They reshape relationships. They redefine roles. They leave a lasting imprint on both the institution and the individuals within it. Because in the world of royalty, every action echoes through history and some decisions can never truly be undone. By the time the machinery of the monarchy begins to move, the outcome is rarely uncertain. Quiet at first, almost invisible, its response builds like a tide. And when it finally reaches the surface, it doesn't just correct the present, it reshapes the future. What had been unfolding in silence was now entering a more structured phase, one governed not by emotion, but by systems that have existed for generations. The monarchy, often perceived as a collection of individuals, operates in reality as something far more complex: a network of protocols, advisors, and internal mechanisms designed to preserve its continuity. And once those mechanisms are engaged, they do not act impulsively. They act with purpose. Behind the scenes, institutional response pathways were being carefully followed, not rushed, not improvised, but executed with a level of precision that reflects centuries of refinement. Advisors, many of whom have dedicated their careers to safeguarding royal precedent, were said to be emphasizing one core principle above all else: consistency. Because the strength of the monarchy does not come from flexibility, but from its ability to apply the same standards across time, regardless of circumstance. Possible enforcement actions, while not publicly confirmed, began to take shape within these discussions. Not as punishments, but as clarifications, measures designed to reinforce boundaries that may have appeared uncertain. Internal rulings, if required, would not be dramatic announcements, but carefully worded decisions that carry authority without spectacle. This is how the institution maintains control, not through confrontation, but through quiet, decisive structure. What makes this process particularly significant is that it is not directed at any one individual alone. The monarchy does not operate on personal terms. It functions as a system, one that must remain stable regardless of who exists within it at any given time. And when a situation arises that tests its limits, the response is shaped not by relationships, but by the need to protect that system as a whole. Because if the structure weakens, everything built upon it becomes vulnerable. Subtle signals began to emerge, not through statements, but through shifts that only those familiar with the institution could fully interpret. Adjustments in protocol, quiet reaffirmations of existing rules, a renewed emphasis on the separation between personal ventures and royal identity. These were not reactions in the traditional sense, but reminders clear, deliberate, and impossible to ignore for those paying attention. The implications of this moment extend far beyond the immediate situation. Other members of the royal family, particularly those navigating public roles, are now observing closely. Because what happens here will influence how similar situations are handled in the future. It will define the boundaries of engagement, the limits of independence, and the expectations placed on anyone connected to the crown. In that sense, this is not just a response, it is a precedent in the making. And perhaps most notably, it signals a broader shift in how modern royalty must navigate the intersection of tradition and commerce. The world has changed. Opportunities have expanded. But the rules that govern the monarchy remain rooted in a different understanding of purpose. Balancing those two realities is not simple, and moments like this reveal just how fragile that balance can be. Yet even as the institution reasserts control, the personal consequences linger far more complicated and far more human. Long after the headlines fade, what remains is legacy. Not the speeches, not the controversies, but the choices that defined them. And for the House of Windsor, this moment may be remembered not for what was said on stage, but for what it revealed behind palace doors. Because beneath the surface of every public moment lies a deeper struggle, one that is rarely seen but always felt. The tension between legacy and personal ambition is not new to the monarchy, but in this instance, it has taken on a sharper edge. What does it mean to carry a name that is not entirely your own? What does it demand of you when your identity is tied to something that must endure long after you are gone? These are the questions that linger now, quietly shaping the narrative long after the immediate controversy begins to fade. For Prince William, the path ahead has become even more defined. Not easier, but clearer. Each moment like this reinforces the role he is stepping into, a role that requires not just leadership, but restraint. Not just vision, but discipline. Because the future king is not measured by how he reacts in moments of calm, but by how he protects the institution in moments of uncertainty. And in doing so, he becomes not just a figure of continuity, but a guardian of something far more fragile than it appears. For Prince Harry, the reality is more complex. Positioned outside the traditional structures, he exists in a space that offers freedom, but also distance. The ability to define his own path comes with a cost: the gradual separation from the very system that once defined him. And as that separation grows, so too does the challenge of balancing independence with identity. Because even when one steps away, the connection to the crown is never entirely severed. It lingers, shaping perception, influencing decisions, and, at times, creating conflicts that cannot easily be resolved. This is the paradox at the heart of the modern monarchy. It must evolve to remain relevant, yet remain unchanged to preserve its meaning. It must allow individuality, yet maintain unity. And when those forces collide, as they have here, the result is rarely simple. It is layered, it is emotional, and it often leaves behind questions that cannot be answered in a single moment. At its core, this situation is not just about rules or boundaries. It is about trust. The quiet understanding that every member of the royal family carries a shared responsibility to protect, to preserve, and to uphold something that belongs not to them, but to the nation. And when that trust is tested, even subtly, the impact can be profound. Because trust, once strained, is not easily restored. Speculation about the future continues to grow. Some believe that time may soften the divide, that distance may eventually give way to reconciliation. Others see a different path, one where the separation becomes permanent, defined not by conflict, but by the quiet acceptance that the two worlds can no longer fully align. And perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, in a space where connection remains, but is forever changed. What remains undeniable is the weight of responsibility that comes with being part of the monarchy. It is not simply a role. It is a lifelong commitment to something greater than oneself. And every decision, no matter how small it may seem in the moment, contribute to a legacy that will be judged not just in the present, but in the years to come. Because in the end, the crown endures not through individuals, but through the legacy they leave behind. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.